Welcome to the first segment in priming. Priming is a major lever in the first step. So we have the 7-step reset, which I'll get into in a moment. And you may have seen some of these videos before if you've been watching. I go live every day. So if you've seen it, you know the 7-step reset, but I'll cover it again. But the step 1 has 5 major levers: beliefs, neuroplasticity, command of that, being able to impact your habits based on your life design, etc. Priming, which is massive. Neuroplasticity is massive. Beliefs are massive. And then you have mindset, massive. You know, the growth or fix, but it's not just having a growth or fixed mindset. It's being able to get back to a growth mindset very quickly. First of all, noticing when you slipped into a fixed mindset and then getting back to a growth mindset and doing so in seconds, not minutes, not hours. And then the physiology. And I can say each one is massive because it dictates your future from that point forward. I can't say one is more important than the other because each one of them can influence the other node. So without the neuroplasticity, you're going to have trouble priming yourself because you won't have the habits. Without the priming, you'll keep falling into old traps and mental heuristics that keep you from using the neuroplasticity. Without a mindset, you won't believe that any of this is possible. And I'm going to start there because more than 90% of the people I speak to, other than neuroscientists, and this includes, I hate to say it, but the coaches, consultants, therapists, counselors, I'd love to hear from you. If you take exception to what I'm saying, you can join me here on stage. I'd love to have this conversation with you. This is so important. And the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. So in the chat, you have the URL to join me on stage, and you have the URL for the landing page where I govern the live program. So 7stepreset.com/live, and that's where you see old or past versions. You see the next upcoming version. The biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. And without the mindset that you can do this, then all of this is going to fall on deaf ears. So what I was saying is that 90% of the people I talk to, and unfortunately includes all areas, it's probably more like 95%, think that it's not possible to change habits. Now, they don't walk around saying that, but you can tell in talking to people where their barrier is, where their hard stop is. And they can do all this stuff. And these are people who understand emotional intelligence. They understand the models that we're talking about. They understand neuroscience. Because their own experience is that habits don't change. You can't change the habits. And there's lots of reasons why, which is why I have a 7-step. So I'll spend a little bit of time today explaining priming. Today is all about priming, but I'm going to show how it's interrelated with neuroplasticity. And the 7-step reset is very fractal. So it applies to the microstimulus response cycles that are happening 1,000 times a day. It applies to the decisions, quote unquote. 95% of those decisions are obviously habitual because 95% of what we do is done by habit. But that's 33,000 times a day. And it applies to the 1-day shifts. When I talk about neuroplasticity, which I did the last 3 days, neuroplasticity, that changing habit at the macro level or at the mid level is the same 7-step reset, and changing habits at the macro level. If I want to change my identity over a 90-day period, it's at that, it still applies. So it's very fractal. And what I'm doing with the 7-step reset is right now I'm talking about the self. This is first having governance over ourselves, the personal leadership, agency. We have to have that before you're going to lead others. Now, you can lead others without it, but there's going to be gaps. So I start with the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. These are in our control. So I've run laps with the client around these 4 levers. And it's the first 3 are easy. People understand that. Yes, it's in my control. When I get to the middle one, emotional, there are many references a person will have where they were hijacked. They were emotionally hijacked. And as a result, they did not get to execute what they intended. And so you could do everything right in the mental, physical, spiritual. But if people can push your buttons and get a different kind of reaction from you because of the emotion, then we're still not in full agency when it comes to the right side. So the model is that we gain control, agency, personal leadership in the first four, sets the identity, and then we can go for the relationship, professional, and financial. So I say that's the quest, the goal, the purpose, the vision, whatever it is. We want to start here, not here. Too many times people start here, right? The vision, they know how much money they want to make, and then they kind of back into it, and it breaks down. When you start over here and you get the identity right, this unfolds naturally. And especially now in the time when things are changing so quickly, and you want to be able to maintain a principle-based approach, because if you stay with principles, the world conforms around you, because the world is always going to come back to the principles. And by basing your decision making on principles, which is what I talk about for the right side, you're not going to be long out of sync before the world conforms back to you. So that's the 7 performance series. And the reason I came up with the 7-step reset is because in order to make the change here, especially initially in the beginning when, habit is, like I said, the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. In that beginning part, it's sometimes very difficult because you're asking a person to change a habit, but habit is in control of them. So then the next one, the 33,000 times a day, this pre-stimulus conditioned reaction response cycle is happening. And you could Google everything I'm saying because I use layman terms and I want to do it in a practical way. No woo-woo, no obscure neuroscience terms. I bring up the reticular activating system and I do talk about the neurons, but we don't get into much deeper than that. But if you look up how many decisions does a person make in a day, you'll see 33,000 decisions per day. Well, we know that 95% of what we do is done by habit, so that's more like, okay, maybe 31,500 of them are actually stimulus response cycles. And so this is happening all day long. So to change a person's point of view at any point in time during the day, they are already primed. They are already set to have a certain reaction. They are already biased. And this makes it hard. This is what leads to people saying habits, you can't change habits. The reason why people are saying they can't change habits, in my opinion, is that they're putting their effort from here. Notice I'm putting a line right in the middle of that. They're putting the effort from the middle of the conditioned reaction on. They're ignoring the importance of this. Now, some people get it, right? They start talking about, they do the meditation, they do things to get to the present moment. But even with those people, they sometimes struggle with getting the habits in place that they want. There's a lot of automaticity that happens here, and you have to understand the nature of it in order to get through the automaticity. Now, what I'm doing is that 7th step is very fractal because it works at the micro level. So at the micro level, there's about 100,000 plus stimulus response cycles a day. If you roll up to that, to the 33,000 decisions, that's about 1 every other second, given that we're awake about 65,000 seconds a day. But if you go back to my neuroplasticity yesterday and the 2 days before, it applies there as well. You're still working on changing habits. And if I'm changing habits that unfold over a year, it's still there's still a pre-stimulus, there's still a conditioned reaction step. And actually, it's really a whole lot of them, right? It's many, many, many of these conditioned reaction steps. And then our response. So here's what the 7-step looks like. The 7-step reset is you start with step 1, and I mentioned that there's beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. Step 2 is sort of a dashboard, but this is a very important step because if you do any audio or recording, they have these audio interfaces or these audio tools that will be listening, and video too. So when you click record, it picks up the previous 2 seconds and includes that. So it's like always listening, which is pretty cool. You hit record, and that way you don't get clipped. You're not coming into the person mid-sentence because it already has the prior to. That's really step 2. Step 2 is the listening because there's another stimulus coming. if we're awake 65,000 seconds a day, we make 33,000 decisions a day. That's a new stimulus response cycle every other second. Another one is coming. And so the step two is sort of the listening, but it's looking at what's my state? What's my mental state, my physical state, my emotional state? What does my physiology say? What is my self-image? And you can gauge your self-image if you want to look at sort of a real dashboard. You can look at your self-talk. If your self-talk is degrading and reminding you of your mistakes, etc., and I'll talk about how you get from there back to where you want to be, powerful present moment. But if you know your state is, your self-image is lower than where it needs to be, it's worth it to get out, take a walk, maybe do some box breathing. If you don't have the time for a walk, you want to change something. There's other things you can do, which we'll talk about. Essentially, what it comes down to is like 1 minute moments, where the same thing that happens with meditation, where you put space between the conscious and the network of neurons, aka subconscious chatter. The 1 minute moments put space, and that space with some other tools allows you to get back to the powerful present moment quickly. You don't have to wait for hours. And the example would be if something happens and a person gets triggered. For some people, it might be if they speed a lot, police car lights light up, and they get this rush, or maybe they see a police car on the side, they get this rush of cortisol preparing for the adrenaline. And then that, if it's intense enough, if they're going fast enough and the police car looks like it's going to come out, that turns into a neurobiological event. It's fight or flight. And the system is not structured. It's not a mind. The subconscious is not a mind at all. It's a network of neurons. So it's flooding the system with the adrenaline ready to fight a tiger. And this is why some traffic stops go bad. But you get the point. So that's step two. We'll get into that. I'll be into step two next week, and we'll unpack that. But step two is really important. And I'll talk about priming today, but step two is really the priming for this whole thing. Now, what I was going to say earlier is that we have to master this process with ourselves first. So where I'm going with these daily events, right now I'm in the self. I'm in the personal leadership, having agency over self, commanding our own present moments so that we have the automaticity working for us. Then I'll slip into the guidance step, the leading others. Think of that as one-to-one. And I could argue that the spans of control at work, 6 to 8 people being ideal, is because leadership, while you're leading a group, a lot of the leadership happens when you look at building high-performance teams as one-to-one. If you think about a coach of a sports team, they're leading the sports team on the field, and in practice they're looking at the group, but there's a lot of one-to-one conversation. So leading has a big one-to-one component, and that's really at play here, because by the time the stimulus reaction happens, it's too late. You're no longer leading, you're fixing. And then the third phase is culture. So we have self, one-to-one, and then culture. And in the one-to-one, we're using, this is dynamic leadership, by the way. It all comes under dynamic leadership. In the one-to-one, we are giving guidance, but this is where we're moving across this continuum between command and control and servant leadership. We're creating the environment. We're leaning into intrinsic motivation, and we're doing this, and it's like I said, it's like a one-to-one, but that's all happening here in these first two steps. By the time the conditioned reaction hits for your people, it's too late. You're just fixing. And then the third phase is culture. So culture is a roll-up of the habits at the individual level. So if I take all the people in the organization and I roll them up and I look at that collectively, that's going to be the culture. And so even culture goes through this 7-step. It's going to be a lot longer than today. We're talking about 1 second. If you're talking about culture, you're talking about a lot more than a second. You're talking years perhaps to change culture, but it goes through this same process, and it makes sense to understand this. The conditioned reaction is the one thing that sticks out, because this is happening at the network of neurons level, and the network of neurons, aka subconscious, and it's not a mind, but people still call it the subconscious, and they will be, because textbooks have been calling it a subconscious mind for the last few hundred years, and it wasn't until more recently when the brain scanning tools became available that help scientists see what's actually going on in the brain, and they recognize it's not a subconscious, it's not a mind, it's actually a network of neurons. So that's the basis of this, and it helps to understand that. So when you look at all of this through that lens, you can see that habit change is possible. In fact, it's very accessible if you do it the way the system was designed. And there's clues for that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is where I'm going to spend some time on the priming conversation, because a lot of it happens here. But before I do, so when we look at priming, and people know the term, but what they don't realize is how ubiquitous it is and how impactful it is. If you're leading others, if you're working with people, helping people make changes in their lives, I really recommend reading the book Before You Know It by John Bargh, and that's Bargh. John Bargh, Before You Know It. This guy has been studying, and he calls it the subconscious, and I think in the past you had to call it a subconscious or subconscious mind, or the book is not going to be published by a major publisher, because it's been called the subconscious mind for 300 years, 400 years. That one book is not going to change that. That's just my point of view, and how so many great books stop short of not calling it a subconscious mind. They stop short of making it the network of neurons. But your neuroscientists clearly know that it's a network of neurons, and even they call it a subconscious, because it's sort of like, in my mind, Galileo and Copernicus looking at the Earth is actually revolving around the sun, whereas everything in society was saying astronomy is the study of how the sun revolves around the Earth. So it feels like that to me. There are a few examples that make you go, wait a minute, this is big. One of them is the study where they put these 70-year-old people in an environment for 5 days, and everything in that environment was from 20 years earlier, when they were 50 something. Everything, magazines, the furniture, the way the TV looked, everything was from 20 years earlier. And this is not in John Bargh's book, I don't think. This is in others. Within a week, their biomarkers changed. They were more flexible. Their gait was longer and more brisk. Their the cognitive processing improved just by being in the environment. So the environment primed them. There's a lot of these studies, but I think most people have heard the blue-eyed, brown-eyed study. This was back in the 50s, where the teachers were told that blue-eyed kids are smarter than brown-eyed kids, and those blue-eyed kids did better in class. And then researchers did some others. All of them had higher grades. This was a very disturbing study, right? And then what they did was they went back and they used double blind and groups and large enough samples, etc. And then they had others where they had the kids in certain places in the classroom, and they were told the same thing. Some are smarter, and they showed this, that just telling the teacher that changed the grades of the students. Very disturbing, and it makes you think twice in terms of the role that teachers and coaches play with the children. Another one, this is the one that, there's two of them that got my attention and made me start looking at the network of neurons as much, much bigger than it was. The first one was the Asian American girl study. So you probably have seen the research that has said that people who are primed with their ethnicity sometimes do worse on standardized testing, and then others who are primed on their gender do better or worse. So these researchers got creative and said, this is interesting. What happens if we combine them? So, for example, they used a math test, because in math, it's assumed that, this is teenage, they were like, I think, 14 years old, that the boys are better at math than girls. That was a narrative that was out there at the time, and still is, I think, at least in the U.S. And then there's another narrative that Asians are better at math than non-Asians. And don't come at me, I'm just paraphrasing what the study said. John Bargh, and this is in John Bargh's book, Before You Know It. So then they said, well, what happens if they validated it, right? One and then the other, and it showed what they expected. The scores were better when they were primed for the gender or the ethnicity, depending on who was, thought to be good at math. And then they said, what happens if we combine them? So they put them both on there. And what was interesting is whichever one they put first is the one that dominated. So for the Asian American girls, they thought that this would break the system, right? What's going to happen? Because these Asian American girls, they're girls, so they're thought to be less at math than the boys, but they're Asian, so they're thought to be better at math than Americans. And what they found was that it depended on which one they put first. So when they put gender first, their math scores went down. When they put ethnicity first, their math scores went up. Fascinating. And that was like, whoa, because at the time I was studying cognitive biases and how these impact our personal development efforts and how they impact leading others. When I read that, it kind of changed things because I recognized intuitively, but it turns out it's true, that I thought priming was more important than cognitive biases. And it's not that it's more important, it's that it's coming before. And that's why I went through that part of the conversation where I was saying that in step 2, we are pre-listening. This is like the recorder pre-listening to the environment so that when you push record, it's already picked in. Priming is happening here even before the conditioned reaction kicks in. So priming is happening here before this conditioned reaction kicks in, which is extremely important because if you want to change your habits, you have to change it at the priming level. And if you're going to change it at the priming level, you absolutely have to change it before the conditioned reaction happens. The other study that made me rethink my everything I thought I knew was when they showed that they took, the double blind. People think they're researching something else, but they're really the subject of the research. They had these subjects walking around doing grading and things like that, and they were looking at whatever and having interactions. And what they found is if the person was holding a cup of warm liquid, their responses were more compassionate than they were if they were holding a glass or cup of cold liquid, right? And actually, if they were holding warm liquid, they were more compassionate than if they weren't holding anything. And if they were holding a cup of cold liquid, they were less compassionate than if they were not holding anything. This seemed to be more than priming, and it's what helps you start to separate the mind from the network of neurons. So the network of neurons, warm is warm, right? Cold is cold. And that was priming the system. And because what's happening in step 2 is the pre-listening, you're already priming the person to have a more compassionate response. So when the stimulus happens, their response is more compassionate. Don't take my word for it, please. Take a look at the book, listen through it. I think it's a fascinating read for leaders. Every leader should know about what's going on with priming because it's where we live. The more people that report to you, the more you have to be thinking step 1, which is where I am, beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. And even the words that we use prime people. So the third study, I think, that puts a pin in this thing that it's not a mind, is when they had people reviewing resumes, again, researchers not realizing they were the subjects, and some of them were carrying a heavy clipboard and others were carrying a light clipboard. The ones that were carrying a heavy clipboard rated the people on those resumes as having more depth, having more weight, having more substance. The ones with the light clipboard, the same kind of resumes. They do studies. They have to have a large enough sample so they weed out all the coincidental stuff, right? They were weighted as less substantive. I'm smiling because I mean it's taking me back to when I was looking at it, and I kept like, whoa, this changes things. And at the time I was talking about cognitive biases, and I had to rethink that whole thing. So what I know now is that priming happens before. Priming is not bigger than cognitive biases, but it's pre. And if you think about the subconscious processing 11 million bits per second, the network of neurons, and it can do that because it's energy that's flowing through those neurons. And by the way, thought is energy also at its most base level. But the conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second, whereas the network of neurons processes at 11 million bits per second because it's energy flowing through there. So when you have the conditioned reaction happen, that's why I said it's too late. There's already, in a quarter of a second, there's already potentially 2 million bits of information processed, and the conscious mind is not even engaged yet because the conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second, whereas the subconscious has a reaction time of about a quarter of a second. And this changes. I mean, you could get it down to 150 milliseconds with training. That's what athletes live. And it can go higher if you're distracted. This is why they say a person talking on a cell phone, even if it's hands-free, they sometimes have the same reaction time of a person who's alcohol impaired. And that's because they're preoccupied with something else, and so it takes longer for their reaction time to happen because the network is preoccupied, it's focused on something else. I'm going to talk more about priming in step 2 because it's big there. I'm also going to talk about priming in a larger way. On step 1, I spent 3 days just talking about neuroplasticity because this is very important to the self. When I get into the one-to-one and leading others and guidance, priming is much more important. So is step 1, but priming is very important because every moment the leader is creating an environment, whether we're talking about the 33,000 decisions a day or the big shifts that are happening over a year's time, a leader is always setting that environment. That's why you have to look at it as a fractal system. I have been talking about the comfort zone, and you can go back and look at the prior videos. They're on that website, 7stepreset.com/live. Person's in their comfort zone, and I am talking about anxiety in this series, I know, but I go off into the transformation, and they both are very, very similar because it's both a process of neurons firing and wiring together in such a way and creating emotion or creating outcomes. And there's a lot of similarities and factors, but in anxiety, of course, we drop down, and then to get back up, it's similar to how it is to break out of the comfort zone and go back up. Whereas when we're breaking out of the comfort zone, we're having resistance that's coming from our I don't want power and our survival, the survival mechanisms. That's all conditioning. It's like, don't do it, it's dangerous, it's unfamiliar. That's all pushing us down. Our stories, our beliefs, that's all pushing us down. But once we get above it, those arrows flip because the same survival mechanism that was trying to keep us from crossing that barrier are now helping us survive because they don't want us to die. It's the same thing. It's let's keep you alive and let's make sure you survive. But it's happening in 11 million bits per second, which is why it feels like you can't beat the habits, but you can. And then this symbolizes the breaking out of the comfort zone, and not just breaking out, but having that trajectory that goes up here. And I talk about principles, and I use the term near principles because up here there's a lot of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, and ambiguity. There's a lot of that up here, and we don't want to be dealing with that. We don't want that to come into play. Whether it's opportunities and threats, we're not going to deal with that. And the way to not deal with it is by near principles. Why is this important? Because here you have your habits. You have the 0 to 7 conditioning, the teenage and especially the 19 to 27 forming of the model of the world is the prefrontal cortex fully formed. So that's all locked in with conditioning, and this is why it's so hard to break out of these comfort zones, these corridors, and everything is keeping you there, and breaking out requires energy to break through the beliefs, the stories, the habits, the thought patterns, the environment, the anchors, etc. But once you break through, now you have a new problem. It's very unfamiliar. You're in the field of infinite possibilities, and that in and of itself can create some stress. And this is why on my 7-step reset, we take a look at this and the importance of this steps 1 and 2 to make sure that we get ahead of it and we're priming ourselves. Now, there's something that happens in this process. We already said that there's 33,000 decisions or daily stimulus response cycles. When you do this work and you are priming in such a way that it changes what happens in your conditioned reaction. So there's two big levers. One is we're going to shift from a fear bias or threat bias of the conditioned reaction to a neutral bias of the conditioned reaction. So what does that mean? If you go back 10,000 years, as the human is in hunter-gatherer environment, and some things say the brain is 200 to 300,000 years old, you can see why in a hunter-gatherer environment we were biased towards making sure that we were safe and that we were looking for the tiger on the Serengeti, proverbially speaking. But then when you take that same framing, and by the way, if you take 10,000 years of the human existence, and it's more than that, but 10,000 years of human existence, 9,500 of those was as a hunter-gatherer. So from an evolutionary standpoint, what we've experienced as humans in the last 500 years, and remember, cars were not really used as a mode of transportation until like 125, 150 years ago, and certainly computers and technology, there weren't even computers in the homes 50 years ago, and the computers that were in existence were huge to do what the phone in your pocket does. What we grew up with from 0 to 7, or what was conditioned, is very different than what we have now. So that's why I call it a reset, because we have to reset it. So step 1 is or part of that is we take the fear bias out of it. The second thing that we do is we condition in the pause. That pause between conditioned reaction and response is there for a few reasons. One, we don't want the response to equal the reaction. By definition, those reactions are typically survival reactions because the subconscious or the network of neurons wants to survive. So if it's a survival reaction, it's coming with that kind of life or death energy. And it's easy for the response to equal the reaction, again, because the network of neurons is processing at 11 million bits per second, whereas the conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second. So it's outgunned. And if it's a big threat, this is where you get the videos of the people getting triggered, and it just scales up, and you're like, how could they be saying that? That's so irrational. It makes no sense. Well, it makes sense from the network of neurons, because when they're being triggered, it's not that different from a phobia. And if a person watches a person who's afraid of spiders or snakes interacting with a fake spider or snake, it's not rational, but they're still going through the things. The palms are sweaty, right? And that is what's going on with triggering. So we have to have that pause, and we condition in the pause. And the second thing we do is condition in a check-in. So the response is the response, but it's not the external response yet. It's the internal response. The reaction is internal, the response is internal, and while it's still internal, before I let it become action, which is step 6, I do a check-in and say, am I being emotionally triggered? And if so, then what we need to do is step 5, which is emotional modulation, letting the emotion flow through. It takes 0 to 90 seconds for that to happen. If you don't let the emotion flow through, energy and motion, then it turns into a biological event. It gets lodged in the network of neurons, and it's now part of the associations. And so when we're getting triggered in here, we're pulling in emotions from the past. So there is a process in this transformation work. And if you're working on anxiety, by the way, none of this is mental health. It's just the process that we're going to use to deal with the daily VUCA. But you can process out many of those past emotions so they're not that razor edge kind of like triggering thing, right? I was talking about buttons. If you have buttons that people are pushing, it's worthwhile to go through and modulate each of those emotions one by one. Just keep modulating through it, because you neutralize it. Once you process it, it lets it move through. You don't want them lodged in your network of neurons. The emotion is a signal. It's there to tell you something. You learn from it. So I say locate it, label it with a name, and there's Dr. Rosenberg in a book, 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. She talks about there's 8 emotions that encompass all of the uncomfortable emotions, and uncomfortable emotions are the emotions that are associated with anxiety. And those 8 are sadness, shame, vulnerability, embarrassment, frustration, anger, helplessness, and disappointment. So if you just think about those 8, what we're going to do about that particular feeling is different. It's different if it's anger versus helplessness. It's different if it's embarrassment versus disappointment. It's different if it's helplessness versus frustration. Maybe those are more similar, but let's say helplessness versus shame. Those are all different. You're going to have a different action, a different response. That's part of the modulation process. You let the emotion pass through, and the reason I went on that little tangent was because my model is to locate it. Where is it in my system? And that's allowing you to get some space. Now you're bringing the conscious mind in, so you're not in that reaction mode. The conscious mind is now engaged, and when the conscious mind is engaged, it's more the you. I talk about the you versus the network of neurons, but most people are living their lives 95% by habit, so the you is only in charge 5% of the day, which is why we just keep having more yesterdays for our tomorrows. And that you, when you are asking where is it, that's engaged. The you, the conscious mind, is engaged, and then you label it. And the reason you label it is because now you can do something about it. When it's just anxiety, which is what these 8 roll up to, and she goes on and talks about how that anxiety leads to anxiety spirals, and it leads to people not wanting to take action because they've had anxiety spirals before, and they're afraid of them, and they avoid them, so they don't take chances, they don't accept promotions, etc., etc. And then by labeling it, you can do something about it, and then you learn from it. So it's LLL, locate it, label it, learn from it, because it is a signal. And then you can take your action, do it, delay it, discard it, or delegate it or discard it. And then Step 7 is coming back to, that was the slide I was talking about with the multiple, stimulus response cycles, right? We come back to the response, and then we have to get back. We're priming ourselves to the next one. That's the topic of today, is priming. When I was talking about neuroplasticity yesterday, I drew this diagram of what happens. I already mentioned that the conscious mind has a reaction time of a half second. So this line over here is a half second. The network of neurons has a reaction time of a quarter of a second. That's your 250 milliseconds. So the stimulus is sort of like in the 250 milliseconds, and the reaction is in the 250 milliseconds. So this would be when the stimulus hits. And remember, I said that there's sort of a pre-listening period. That pre-listening period is out here. This is the step 2. This is the priming. This is where priming is happening. So cognitive biases, that's a mental heuristic. It's a shortcut that the brain uses to not have to repeat stuff because the brain is efficient. And the cognitive biases like confirmation bias, planning fallacy, overconfidence bias, etc., recency bias, all of that comes into play, but the priming happens before that. And then once the subconscious reaction or the network of neurons, that quarter of a second goes away, you have, as I said, positivity. This is a 6-week process to train. You can do this on your own. 3 times a day, 3 repetitions per set. So you have 3 sets per day, 3 repetitions per set. The whole set takes 90 seconds. Because what you're going to do is let negative things come up, and as they come up, you're going to immediately look for the greater positive context. I use the example, if you get a flat tire, that's a negative feeling. You're late for a meeting, and it goes on and on and on. But as soon as it comes up, as soon as the flat comes up and you feel that emotion, you flip to what's the greater positive context. The greater positive context is I have a car, right? The flat couldn't exist if you didn't have a car. But this is not knowledge. This is training. The same way you would train a dog to sit, you have to repeat it over and over and over. So 3 times a day, 3 reps, you're going to do that. But each time you do it with a different negative feeling. And so this is also a way of processing your emotions. It's not the way to process emotions, but it's going to help. And you do that 3 times a day. I did it with meals, and so I would remember. And another example, you have a bad thing happen at work, right? Some meeting didn't go right. But the greater positive context is you have a job. And this is not about PMA. It's not about reframing. It's training the subconscious to immediately look for, is there a greater positive context to this thing, yes or no? If yes, it goes on and looks for other things. This stops it from looking for the negative or looking for the threat by doing this positivity. It takes about 6 weeks. You'll see results in 1 week. But the reason I have people go for 6 weeks is because I need to get deeper into it, because we don't want to have buttons and with bright signs on them. Push here if you want to see, if you want to be entertained, right? We don't want that. Then the next part of it is the associations and then the handoff. What we're talking about today is priming is actually happening in here. So without this conversation, and if you take all the literature that you've read, it would be very easy to believe that this reaction time was just a lag. It was simply a lag. But there's something going on in here. If you ever watch those videos of cats, when you put a cucumber there and they see the cucumber and they jump, or a snake, they jump, cats have a reaction time of about 50 to 80 milliseconds. So theirs is like 1/3 of ours. This is the big point to get here. This priming already started before the stimulus shows up. It's already there. So by the time the stimulus shows up, we're already set. This is why the positivity exercise is so important, because the positivity exercise actually is coming into play here. This is why when clients do this work, they experience less need for emotional modulation, less triggering. I will tell you that I am not seeing 33,000 stimulus response cycles a day. I am not seeing, they tell us there's like almost 10,000 we're exposed to 10,000 ad headlines a day. I don't see them. And the reason I don't see them is because, not because I'm some special person, it's because I am primed so that my internal priming is stronger and more meaningful than the external. Everyone has the ability to do that. In fact, that's the way it was when we were kids. But the prefrontal cortex, forming from age 19 to 27, locks in this model of the world, because in that prefrontal cortex is the 20 billion neurons. So it essentially locks in the conditioning. And that's why in the 20s, all you had to do was show up and you got better. In the teens, you just show up, take a sport, music, whatever it was. You did do some practice, but just show up and you got better. Now, after 30, the way I look at it is that showing up, getting better doesn't work. And people start falling off. They start giving up. They stop trying. And next thing you know, they're living 95% of their lives by habit. And then by the 40s, they're like, man, this is really hard. And then by 50s, they just succumb and resign themselves to the fact that this is all there is. And it's very difficult for a person to even knock on that door. And it's like if you go to the circus, sometimes you'll see the elephant tied up with a small rope around their foot, and this elephant could walk through a building if it wanted to. It could lift up a car, but there's a small rope, and they'll move their foot and they feel that rope and they stop. What's going on? Well, if you go look at the baby elephant, there's a chain and a stake. So they've conditioned the baby elephant with the chain and the stake that they can't pull this thing out. So all you have to do is tie a rope around their foot and they don't move. And this is what I say happens to us by the time we're 50. And so we have these artificial barriers, which is why I use that diagram of moving along and then breaking out, because you have to break through that. But to break through it, again, habit is the biggest obstacle to habit change. So this is the priming. Now, there's external priming. You can use your senses. I already gave you some examples: the warm cup of liquid, the heavy clipboard. Advertising uses priming all the time: words, sounds, music. This is why celebrities are used to sell things and people buy stuff. I was in a shop just the other day, and it was really interesting because there were things in there that may have sold for $100, but this shop had bought them at a very low price because the reason they could be sold at $100 was because the marketing engine was behind it, and the marketing engine taps into this directly. They're priming you, they're tapping into your cognitive biases, they're tapping into, like Robert Cialdini, he talks about this a lot. It's another great book. The book is Influence. If you look at the earlier versions of the book back in the 90s, there were actually 7 factors of unconscious influence. Now it's 6. And he speaks more about it like with cognitive biases. And again, we didn't have the brain scanning tools when he wrote this book in the 80s and late 80s that we do today. So now that's why we now know that this priming is happening well before. And he does get to that, but he talks more about cognitive biases, at least in the edition that I read, which was the earlier one. But those 6 factors would be, let's see, we got rapport or liking, reciprocity, scarcity, authority, and then commitment or consistency. And I left one off. And the one that was added before was the because frame. Simply the word because would put person into a compliance mode. And that is another great book. When you read that one and the Before You Know It by John Barge, you see how powerful this is and why we need to have a handle on it. As a salesperson, is when I read that book, I was in sales more directly, sales management, and later, as I look at it with sales operations, I was using it for the setting up your reward system and compensation. Now, I see that as leaders in setting culture, it's all about the priming. Leaders' role is priming. And I can go on. We'll talk about that when we get there. But I look at leaders in 2 different camps. There are those leaders who are really big managers, right? They have a board that's so strong, and the board is dictating what they do. And while they may have freedom of action in the 6-month time frame, they're actually doing someone else's bidding or some other entity's bidding. I'm not saying they're not leading, but that's different than that person, that business owner who does not have that board, or the board is their people and the board is subordinate to them. That's a different model. And this person knows what it feels like to look into the abyss with no backstop. So that leader has to recognize that they're constantly priming their environment and their organization. The reason I bring that out is not to create some conflict, but if you are doing what the board tells you to do, if they're in that kind of an organization or that's your situation, you don't have the power or the freedom of action or the authority necessarily to really prime the culture. So the culture becomes a result of either the organized or disorganized sets of inputs that come in. This is why we'll be talking about the 7-step approach when I get to one-to-one leading, but more importantly, when we get to setting the culture, setting and establishing the culture. I have this thing up here that says calm. Neuroplasticity, I wrote that because I was talking about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity requires calm in order to have it happen. And this is why when we're talking about priming, we want to be thinking about the fact that this stimulus, that this conditioned reaction is happening in 250 milliseconds with a pre-part, and it's processing about, or at least the potential, 2 million bits. And that's using 11 million bits per second, and we're only taking a quarter of a second. Making changes in here is very difficult. What we want to do is focus on here. And this leads me to, if you have pre-stimulus, if you are a leader, your steps 1 and 2 are this big, and steps 3 we can't control, right? 3 is stimulus. We don't know what stimulus is going to happen. But steps 1 and 2 are huge, and then steps 4 to 7, that's a small set. And I could say that 7 is out here because this is a return to the powerful present moment, to an allostasis state, to agency and personal leadership. So I could say that 7 is big, but the leader, if they're spending their time chasing things in the 3, 4, 5, 6 area, they're missing the boat. We need to get earlier than that. I could go much deeper in priming. It's such a rich topic, and what's nice about this work is you can just Google priming, go down your own rabbit hole if this fascinates you. But as a leader, and I'll get into it in my next phase. That won't be happening probably until January when I start talking about the 7-step in the context of leadership, which is the guidance part. But it's not just guidance; it's the command and control, right? The holding accountable, as well as the coaching for the best version of themselves. Very much like a sports team does. The sports team, that coach is moving between command and control and servant leadership all the time. And there's a definite accountability set and consequences for accountability. It's called sitting on the bench or being kicked off the team. And there's also reward when things go well. And that's where we want to be as leaders, understanding that we're creating this environment, and that culture is what's really happening in this conditioned response step, more so than what we think we're doing. And the more freedom of action you have as a leader, the more you can influence this high performance model. And you can do it in months, not years, if you have enough freedom of action and can make the changes in the environment. And the reason why the environment changes faster is because either people adjust and adopt, or they move into other positions or into other opportunities. And so that helps the thing move. And you're also conditioning. Remember, we're constantly conditioning. It's very fractal. So the same way this model I used happens at the micro level, it happens at the upper levels. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If you go to 7stepreset.com/live, you'll see the next time I'm on, which is going to be Monday at 8 a.m. Pacific time, and I'll be talking about mindset, and I'll bring priming in as some review just to keep the continuity going, because as I said, any one of these can impact the others. And I would say, I want to say that neuroplasticity and priming are the big ones, but I can't, because physiology is a big one, and beliefs are a big one, and mindset is a big one. And if I had to pick one that was less than the others, which I can't really do, but it would be mindset, only because it's smaller and it can shift, and it has less tentacles. That's probably the reason. It has less ways of getting there. But that said, any one of the other four could put somebody into a fixed mindset. If you have any questions, comments, you want to join me on the stage on Monday, there's the link. That link is always going to work. I got Restream to keep it the same. So you can just always use that link, join me on stage. And if I see people wanting to join, I'll pause what I'm talking about, because real examples make this land much faster and much more effectively than me just talking about it. So I love having examples, because everybody has a different weak link or different break in the chain that makes this hard to grasp, and having real conversations about it opens that up. That's it. I'll see you on Monday.